first used to describe a new genre in science fiction literature. Cyberpunk. It was inaugurated with the publication of William Gibson's Neuromancer, winner of the Hugo, Nebula, Locust...
So we're going behind the screen. Well, this month was supposed to be the release of Cyberpunk 2077. However, they delayed it yet again to December 10th as of writing this, so I'm declaring this month, for me at least, Cyberpunk month up until December 10th, where I'll be covering 3 major Cyberpunk tabletops. Cyberpunk 2020, Shadowrun, and GURPS Cyberpunk. And I will be covering just the Cyberpunk book for GURPS, because the history behind that is a lot more interesting than the game itself. Today I'm covering Cyberpunk 2020, but before I do that, I had noticed some confusion coming from the new fans of Cyberpunk regarding what Cyberpunk actually is. So I'll go over that pretty briefly in this video. Let's get right to it, shall we? This is a question that has come up quite a bit regarding all the new Cyberpunk fanboys and girls who didn't realize that this was a thing until they saw Keanu Reeves rear his head as the new Johnny Silverhand. Many people think that the title of the game is what Cyberpunk is. The word never came up before in anyone's vocabulary, and the word hadn't existed until CD Projekt Red made 2077, a totally and completely original idea made by them and them solely, and not by someone else way before. So to clarify, Cyberpunk is a genre first and foremost. Now the genre's history is incredibly rich and goes far back as the 60s, but I won't go too deep with the details, just the main points. Cyberpunk was conceived by a group of people who were looking to rebel against the science fiction norms at the time. While the rebellion didn't necessarily start with them, they kicked it into high gear. Cyberpunk was less an optimistic look at the future, but more of a cautionary vision where the protagonists weren't necessarily heroes, but typically the drudges of society. The name Cyberpunk was coined by Bruce Bethke's novel of the same name. The book dealt with a bunch of disenfranchised youths who were also computer experts who were just around to cause trouble. Later in the 1980s, around 84, William Gibson's cyberpunk masterpiece Neuromancer came to be. This book is where almost all Cyberpunk's tropes and technology stems from. Cyberspace? Neuromancer. Cyberdex? Neuromancer. Street Samurai? Neuromancer. Practically everything you could think of in the genre as a whole almost always pulls from Gibson's work. Later in the life of the genre, Neil Stephens' Snow Crash would contribute even more. He started to introduce the concept of a metaverse, which would allow people to connect to it and live out their lives online, conduct business, etc. While he wasn't the first, his was the most prominent. And the style of parodic writing seen in the novel would contribute to the more tongue-in-cheek side of Cyberpunk. Now that we talked about what Cyberpunk is in some detail, now it's time to talk about the game itself. Cyberpunk as a game was created in 1988 by R. Talsorian Games. It started off as Cyberpunk 2013, and with the new edition, they brought the story to 2020 and updated the rules. CP 2020 is the most fondly remembered of all the books that are out, as the 3rd edition Cyber Generation was not very good, and it got retconned completely with 2077 and Cyberpunk Red. So we're going to pretend Cyber Generation just simply doesn't exist. CP 2020 is the game most everyone talks about and has played well up until now. It's still in print, and you can buy physical copies of all 40 supplements written for the game. And since CP 2020 has been out since 1990, there's at least 30 or more years worth of fan material to help you along your merry way. But what makes CP 2020 so special? What makes it worthy of being a AAA video game? CP 2020 takes place in the fictional Night City, along the border of the newly minted Northern California and Southern California. It's every cyberpunk's wet dream. Big dystopian city, chock full of corporations and loaded to the brim with lowlifes and scum, absolutely ready to pull you limb from limb, all to get your Mr. Stud implant off of your groin so they could sell it for a pretty penny on the black market. Most campaign scene players are edge runners, people who do odd jobs that are typically dangerous for a living, doing dirty work for corporations so they don't have to. In the base game, you can play as a rocker boy, a solo, a media, a netrunner, a corporate, a cop, a techie, a fixer, or a nomad. Each class has a special ability that makes them unique and stand out from the rest. For example, the rocker boy has charismatic leadership, which allows him to sway crowds of people to do what he wants them to do. Netrunning is also part of the game, just as Shadowrun has netrunning as well. Both games have hefty sections just for the hacking in cyberspace, mainly taking up big sections of their books, so if you have a netrunner in your party, expect to be sitting around for quite a bit of time. As for the combat mechanics, it's fast, it's deadly, and surprisingly it's realistic. If you don't believe me on how deadly the combat is in this game, I do have an example from a game I ran. One of my players decided to intimidate a group of heavily armed thugs in the heat of a standoff on a highway bridge. Think of that one scene in Sicario. The player understandably fails. Now, typically I'm a very benevolent GM, and I usually never am out to kill my players, so I reacted to that as realistic as you would expect. I had one of the thugs unload a full auto volley at her, and somehow I managed to get off a good 20 rounds on them, managed to place about 5 headshots where the player didn't have any armor. As you could expect, instantly killed them. Cyberpunk 2020 is as traditional Cyberpunk can get. It's got your megacorps, it's got your over-the-top rockers, the corrupt cops, and a destroyed America. There's no real bells or whistles when it comes to the game. If it's Cyberpunk you want, it's Cyberpunk you're gonna get. Depending on the type of game you play, your Cyberpunk might be Gibsonian, or your Cyberpunk will be kind of like Mad Max, but resources aren't that scarce. The game's not terribly complicated, and the lore is widely available now, saying just how many YouTube channels have spawned since Cyberpunk 2077 was announced, covering all aspects of the game. However, not many channels cover the tabletop game in detail outside of the lore, which is a shame, because this is one of those tabletop games that have withstood the test of time, only getting a new edition this year. CP Red isn't out now, by the way, if you want to get into a newer version of Cyberpunk, though I will almost always recommend 2020 over Red in its current state, seeing how long of life this game has had. Now, I know that this question is going to be brought up, 2020 or Shadowrun. While I'll have a video up soon talking about Shadowrun, I'm going to answer this question on both videos. Like I said before, Cyberpunk 2020 is traditional Gibsonian Cyberpunk. There's no orcs, there's no elves, and there's definitely no magic either. If you want more validation for this game, William Gibson himself didn't care for Shadowrun either, saying himself, "The only negative thing I feel about it is the initial extreme revulsion at seeing my literary DNA mixed with elves. Somewhere somebody's sitting and saying, 'I've got it. We're gonna do William Gibson and Tolkien over my dead body.'" Though, I mean, to be fair, he didn't care for Cyberpunk 2077 either, but he didn't say he was repulsed by it. So there you have it, Cyberpunk 2020. I plan on doing Shadowrun next, and of course I'll have GURPS Cyberpunk as another video. Probably way shorter too, seeing as my experience with GURPS is a little on the lacking side, but I sure do know a lot about Cyberpunk and its Splat book. They got raided by the feds, didn't you know? But hopefully I'll get the GURPS video out before the 10th, but editing these videos are kinda hard. Anyway, see you in the next video, Choomba.
I've gone up on drugs so much, I don't think I can come down, I really don't.